Hey coders, welcome to Coding with NJ channel, where you are currently watching third video in our beginner-friendly Laravel with Livewire series. In this series, we are learning Laravel from scratch by implementing an e-commerce website. So far in our previous two videos, we have created a landing page for the admin dashboard along with its styling. In today's video, we are going to work on the categories part of the website, and while doing so, we will be learning many new Laravel concepts. So let's get started. Well, before we get started, let me introduce and explain some of the terminology that we will be using in this tutorial. Since we are going to store our categories in the database, so why not understand different terminology that is used in Laravel related to the database. So over here you can see our database, and this database can be looked upon from two different perspectives. From the server side, we can access any table in the database using our models. However, if you want to communicate with the database from the client side, that is the browser doesn't know that there is any database with which we are communicating. The browser sees that particular table as a resource. So the word resource comes from the API terminology, which simply means a database table. So when we are defining some logic from the perspective of client side, we will be referring to the same database table as a resource. And if we are defining logic from the backend side, that is the server, we will be looking at the same database table as our model in the Laravel framework. So basically, resource and model represents the same thing, that is database table. However, the term resource is used from the perspective of the browser, while the term model is used from the perspective of the server. So we are going to define these four operations that are applied on any database table, which are called CRUD: create, read, update, and delete. Let's start with this read operation, which is very simple one. Our browser makes a HTTP request to the server asking it to read the data from a particular database table, and the server in return responds back with that data to the browser. Now, since this is a simple request where no data is sent along with this request, so it's a very simple HTTP GET request. So these are different verbs that we can use with the HTTP request: get, post, put, fetch, and delete. So if you are interested in reading a resource, we will make a GET request, and the server will read that table and sends the data back to the client. Likewise, the second simplest request is delete. Again, it's a simple HTTP request where no data is sent along with this request, just the verb is changed, the HTTP method is changed. So to read it, we are sending the GET request, while to delete it, we are sending HTTP delete request. So these are called HTTP request verbs. So we will send a different verb, the server will delete that resource and responds either positively or negatively back to the client. So this request also happens in one go, one request and one reply. However, the creation and update consist of two requests and two responses. So let's start with the create one. So first, the client makes a HTTP request using get verb because it's only asking server or the backend that the client is interested in creating a new resource, that is a new row in the database table, and the server will in return sends back a form to our browser. That form will be displayed in the browser. Now the user can fill in all the fields in that form and now sends another request by submitting the form. And now since there is data in the HTTP request, therefore, we are changing the HTTP verb from get to post. So this post means there is data in the body of the HTTP request. When this data is received by the server, so either the server will insert a new row in the table and responds back OK, or it will send an error message if the server failed to insert new row in the database table. So this creation consists of two operations, two HTTP requests and two HTTP responses. Likewise, same applies to update operation. First, the user or the client informs the server of its intention that it is interested in updating a certain row in the database table. The server in return will send back again a form back to the client, and that form will most likely contain the current data in that particular row as well. Then the user can update those input fields in the form and submits the form using another HTTP request. Now again, since some data is sent along with the HTTP request, we can't use GET request. So we can use put or fetch. We can't use post either because post means this is new data, this is fresh data. Whereas put and fetch indicates that this is not a new data, rather some of the rows which already exist in the database is being updated. And you can use any of these verbs, either put or fetch. You usually use fetch when you are changing one or two fields, and you usually use put when you are changing almost all of the fields in the current row. But both will work just fine. When this request is received by the server, along with this new data, the server will update that particular row and responds back OK or error message. So these are different operations that we perform on the rows which are in the database table. Now this was the one section. Now let's discuss in this workflow that we just discussed, how does our controller comes in the picture. So when this request is received by the server, this request goes to one of these actions or methods in the controller. If you are making a request to create a new resource, that is the first request in the create one, the get request, that request will be handled by the create method in the controller. So that means our controller should have a method with the name create. So these are not mandatory names. You can change the names as well. You can replace this name create to, let's say, insert or new row or anything you like. However, these are the conventions that are promoted by the Laravel community. So almost everyone in the Laravel community will be using this name for making the first request to create a new row. So it's always good to stick with the conventions of the community. So when this first request is received by the server, that request will be served by this create method in the controller. This create method will return a form back to the client. The client will fill in the input fields and submit another HTTP request, a post HTTP request back to the server. This time, this request will go to another method or action in the controller, which is named save. Now this method or action will actually store the new data which is filled in by the user into the database. So these two methods collectively create a new row in the database table. Then let's come to the read request. Now you can make a request to read all the rows in the database table or just one specific row. So if you are making a request to read all the rows in the database table, then your request need to be served by a method or action named index. However, if you are asking for a specific row in the table, such as a row with ID 3, then that particular request is going to be handled by another action named show. So these two methods will send back the data in the database table back to the user. When it comes to updating a particular resource, then the first request where you show your intention that you want to update some particular resource, you will make a request which is going to be handled by an action which is named edit. When I'm saying action, it simply means a method, but in controller terminology, the word action is often used, which simply means a method. Anyways, again, the data is sent back to the client. Now the client will update some of the fields in the form and submit that form back to the server. And the server will call the update method along with that data. And this update method will actually update that particular row in the database table and informs the client whether that operation of updation was carried out successfully or not. And for the delete operation, it makes a HTTP request with the HTTP word delete, which is eventually handled by the destroy method in the controller. So I hope you are clear with this part as well. Now let's move on to the web routes. Now, if you notice over here, this route, and then there is this get. All of these web routes have this route keyword because it's a facade that we are using, which we discussed in our first video. Then this routes get method we are using. That means it's a HTTP get request. This is also a HTTP get request. This is HTTP post request. This can be HTTP put or fetch request, and this is HTTP delete request. So by putting get, post, put, fetch, or delete, we are actually defining the HTTP word that we want this HTTP request to be sent along. Then as an argument, we have this URL, and actually this is supposed to be an array. So each of these methods take two arguments as its parameters. The first one is the URL, which will pinpoint to the specific resource that we are interested in, and the second one is an array. And this array contains two elements. The first one is the name of the controller, which we want to accept the request that we are sending and handle it. And the second element of this array is actually the name of the method or action that we want this controller to handle this request through. So if this is the particular URL and the request is HTTP GET request, then this controller should handle this request using this particular method. Now, if this is the URL, request is GET, then this is the controller that should handle the request using the show method. So this means, and this URL must not be the same. If they were the same, then the router will be confused as to which of these actions of the controller should handle the request. So that means these URLs must be different. And same applies to the create one. Because again, the HTTP verb is get, controller is same, only the action is changed. So that means in order for this create to receive this request, this URL must be unique to these two URLs. So these three URLs must not match. Now since this is a post request, so it doesn't matter if this URL matches one of these three URLs, because these three URLs are get URLs, this one is post. So even if this URL matches one of these URLs, because the verb is different, the router in the Laravel framework will not be confused, and it will redirect this request to the controller as save method. Again, this is a get request, so that means this URL must be different from these four URLs so that it could be easily redirected to the edit method. For put and fetch, it doesn't matter if it matches one of these URLs over here because it has a unique HTTP verb attached to it. Likewise, delete is also okay, so we don't have to worry about the URL being similar to one of these URLs because the verb is different. And if this request comes, delete method of this controller will handle that request. We will see how these URLs can be made different in today's video as well. Okay. Now there is some more terminology. I know there is a lot of terminology in today's video, but this is very important in order to understand the framework. I feel the only thing that hinders our understanding or intimidates us when we are learning a new framework is its terminology and how those terminologies, puzzle pieces fit into the puzzle. Once we get around those terms, it's an easy ride. Okay, now the database terminology. Besides this model, you will also hear the term migration and migrate as well. And there are some more: Eloquent and Query Builder, Seeder and Factory. We won't be discussing these in details. We are only going to discuss these three in details at the moment. We will get to the seeders and factory part maybe in future videos, but since we won't be using them at the moment, so I'm not going to explain them at the moment. However, you should be aware that there are these two terms, seeder and factory, which are also associated with the database. Okay, so the word model is used when the server wants to communicate with a table in the database which already exists. So if you have directly worked with a database, when you execute these statements, select, insert, update, and delete, these type of operations will be performed through this model. So remember, a model comes into play when we are interacting with a table that already exists. However, if we want to create a new table, like we use create table in our MySQL database or some other database, then we are defining the structure of the table. We are defining the table name, the columns in that table, their data types, these sort of things we are defining using this create table. The equivalent to this create table operation is a file which is called migration. So when we say let's define a migration, that means we are defining the structure or schema of a database table through Laravel. So any file which defines the structure of a new database table, that file is called migration. So migration is simply a file. We are defining a new database table structure. So as you know, we create a database table in the MySQL, then we execute this statement to actually create this table. So the similar concept in the Laravel as well. So migration is just the table which defines the structure. To actually make that table being created in the database, we have to execute a command which is called migrate. So the migrate will take all the migrations, goes to the database and creates those files in the database table. So I hope you are clear. We use model to communicate with a table which already exists. We use migration file which will define the structure of the new table that we want to create in the database, and we actually want to make that table physically get created in the database. That concept means we have migrated this migration. So migrate will actually create whatever is defined in the migration table in the database. So I hope this is also clear. Now the Eloquent and Query Builder. Both the Eloquent and Query Builder are means to communicate with database. Of these two, you have already been introduced to the Eloquent way of communicating with the database. Don't sound surprised. Actually, whenever you define a model to represent a database table, you are actually defining an Eloquent model. Eloquent is an ORM, object relational mapping, that sits between your application and database and make the communication with the database seamless with your application. You manipulate the tables as objects and perform CRUD operations on it by calling methods of that object. So Eloquent sits at a higher level of abstraction. However, if you want to write database queries which are more closer to the database syntax, you will go for the Query Builder. It sits at a slightly lower level of abstraction than the Eloquent model. In this tutorial, we will be using Eloquent and we won't be using the Query Builder, but you should be aware that both of these ways exist to communicate with database. If you use Query Builder, then you don't have any models in your database. Okay, so now we have covered almost all of the terminology that is required in order to actually understand today's tutorial, except for one little thing, which was this URL. Remember I said these three URLs and this fourth one, they are supposed to be different URLs. As long as they are different in any way, it's okay. But Laravel community uses a convention for these URLs as well. In fact, most of the REST API community follows this convention. So let's go and have a look at that convention in the Laravel docs. So this is Laravel documentation for the controllers, and over here you can see the examples of the different URLs that are given. So this example is basically based on a resource which is called photos over here. In our case, we are working with categories. So our URI is going to be /categories. And that means we are going to create a table in the database with the name categories as well. So if it's just /categories, that means we are interested in getting all the rows in that categories table. And Laravel provides us with a way to give an alias to these URLs as well, which are called route names. So the advantage of having route names is that suppose later on we change this URI from /photos to let's make it /singlephoto. So one S has been removed. In that case, if we have used this URI at let's say 10 different places in our website, then we will have to manually go to all of those 10 places and remove this S from that URI. The alternative is, had we used the route names photos.index in place of this /photos, then we don't have to make those changes anywhere in all of the URIs which are being referenced through its alias photos.index. So this is the advantage of having route names. Okay, now let's move to the show, which is also supposed to display one particular row from that categories table. So the first part is same /photos. Then we have another part appended /photo, single photo, and it's enclosed in curly brackets. So you can think of this as a variable or placeholder. So this photo will be replaced by the primary key of that category. In most of the cases in database, the primary key is almost always the ID. So whatever is the ID, that ID will be placed over here. So this way, now we are uniquely identifying one particular row from the categories table. And this has also made this URL different from this URL. Remember, the verbs are same and the resource name is also same. However, we have attached one more path to this URI. So based on this URI, if it's just /categories, then the controller will execute the index method. However, if the path is /photos /id, id1, 2, or whatever is the id, then the show method will execute. So for the create one, the URI convention is the resource name and then /create is appended at the end. So that now, even though the HTTP verb is get, but this URI is different from this first one and this one as well. Likewise, for the store, we can just write /photos like this first one. Now these two URIs are the same. However, because the verbs are different, so there is no confusion over here as well. For the edit, the URI is /photos, that means whatever is the database name categories. Then the singular one, placeholder, which will be replaced by the primary key, and then /edit. For the fetch one, again, because the verb is different, so we are saying /photos and then /one particular photo ID. For the delete, /photos and then the photo ID. The route names are photos.index, photos.create, photos.store, photos.show. In our case, it's going to be categories.index. Again, these are just conventions. You can write any route name you want, but it's always a good idea to follow the conventions. So with this, I have covered almost all of the background that we need to have in order to get our hands dirty with the coding. So let's get to it. Now by this time, I'm sure you all have already guessed that whatever we are going to do today is going to revolve around a table called categories, where we will put all the categories that are being offered by our business to the customers to buy different items from. So we are going to start our coding with creation of that categories table. So in order to define that categories table, we basically have to do two things. First, somehow connect our project, the Laravel project that we are working on, with our DBMS. In my case, it's MySQL server. And in that server, we have to create the database itself within which we will be creating the tables. So let's start those two tasks by going to a file which is already made available in the root folder of the project. Let's go down. This one, .in. This is actually short for environment. And this file contains different settings for different elements in our application. For example, over here, if you want to change the name of your app from Laravel to something else, you can do that. Let's make it eShop. I think this is the name that we have given to our project. Okay, so this is the app URL. Let's keep it untouched. Let's go. So this is the part related to the database configuration. We'll be making changes over here. Now in a fresh installation, you will get something like this. The default database server is MySQL. In any fresh Laravel project, you can change it to anything you like. But since we are working on MySQL, so let's keep it same. Then this is the database host, which happens to be the default host for MySQL database as well, localhost. Then this is the default port number where any MySQL server runs. If you have changed the port of MySQL server, then you have to make changes over here as well. But since MySQL server on my system is running on the default port, so I'm going to keep it same as well. So this is the name of the database that is going to be created if it already doesn't exist. You can either go to the MySQL server and create this database yourself, just the database, not the tables, and write the name of that database over here. Or if it doesn't exist, the Laravel will let you know that this database doesn't exist. Do you want it to be created? And if you press yes, a database will be created in MySQL server with this name, whatever name you provide over here. So I'm going to keep it Laravel. You can change it if you like. Then this is the username root. This is also again by default available. If your username is different, you have to replace this name with your username. And this password field will be empty by default. But since my password is root for the MySQL server, so I'm going to write root over here. So now this will create a database in the MySQL server running on this IP address and this port with the name Laravel. And to log into MySQL server, these are the credentials that will be used. Username is going to be used as root and the password is also going to be used as root as well. So save it and close it. So we are done with this part. Now we have to create the database table. So remember, in order to create a new table through Laravel, we have to define a migration. Migration is nothing but a PHP file where we can define the structure of a database table. So we have to use another artisan command, php artisan make, and since we are creating a file, make migration. Now over here we have to provide the name. So the convention for creating migration files is it has to start with create underscore and then the file name, the database table name. In our case, it's categories underscore table. Create categories table. Hit enter. And if you go down, this is a new file that has been added. If you notice, create categories table is the name, and it has been appended by this timestamp, the date and the time. So let's go down. It consists of two functions. This one is up and this one is down. This up method will be executed when you are creating this new table, and this down table will be executed when you actually want to drop or delete this table. So the skeleton for creating and dropping the table is already there. Now in order to create the table, a facade named schema is used and its static function named create is being used. This is the name of the table that is going to be created, and the second argument to this create method is a callback function which takes this blueprint object as its second argument, and within the body of this create method we are creating by default two fields in the database table. One is called ID, so when we say ID it is going to create this field as a primary value in our database table, and the second one is timestamps. So this second argument will actually create two fields in our database table, created add and updated add. If you want more columns in this table, you can add those columns over here. So I'm going to create one column for the category name and another column for its status, whether this category is active or inactive. So if the category is active, it will be displayed on our web page, front-facing web page for the users. If the category is inactive, we won't be able to see that category in the menu bar. So let's create another column to this table. The first one is name. Let's start with the name. Since name is going to be a string value, so we have to call this method string, and as its argument we have to provide the name of the column. It's going to be name, and since we want all the category names to be unique, so we have to chain it with another method called unique to this one. So this will create a column in the categories table with the name of private string, and it's going to be a unique value. Then the second one is table. We are going to use status. So status is going to have two values, 1 or 0. If it's 1, that means status is active. If it's 0, that means it's inactive. So it's going to be Boolean value. Let's give it a name and let's give it a default value, so that if we don't provide this column value when we are creating table rows, by default a specific value should be filled into that column. For that we are using the method. In fact, we are chaining this method called default, and let's give it value 1. We can give it true as well. Since it's Boolean, it will be stored as 1 in the database, because this is how MySQL stores Boolean values in the database. Okay, this is all. We don't want to add anything else. Now we have created one migration, and these migrations are by default provided by the fresh installation of the Laravel. So in that one we have one migration called create users table. So a users table will also be created in this database. Then the second one is create password resets. Third one will be created failed jobs table. Fourth one is personal access tokens. So these 4 migrations or 4 tables will be created because they are already there, and these files will be used in the authentication of users. And the last one, this one, is the one that we have created ourselves. So let's go and run the migrate command so that this migration actually creates tables in the database. So let me expand it. Now let's run those migrations by executing another artisan command, php artisan and migrate. Since this is a fresh migration, so it will create all of these tables. It will first create the database itself and then all of these tables. Hit enter. Okay, the reason it only created one migration, create categories table, because actually I have already created those migrations in that table. So in order to show you, what I'm going to do is that I'm going back to the environment file and change the database name, which doesn't exist. Now let's change this name to Laravel. Now since no database with this name exists, so this time when I run the migrate command, first it will let me know there is no database currently existing in the MySQL server with this particular name. Do you want Laravel to create it for us? I will say yes, and then all of these migrations will be created. The database Laravel does not exist on the MySQL connection. Would you like to create it? Yes or no? So let's press Y and hit enter. Now it's preparing database. Now it went through all of these migrations and created all of those tables. So create users table done, create password reset table done, create telescope entry. Okay, so this is something which is coming from someplace else because I have installed a package as well, telescope package. So you guys can ignore it. In your fresh installation, you won't be seeing this table being created. Then this one is create failed jobs, create personal access tokens, and finally categories table. Now let's go to our MySQL server and actually confirm that this database along with this categories table have been created or not. So this is my MySQL workbench. Let me refresh it, and name was Laravel. There it is. So this is the database table. So sorry, this is the database and these are the tables. The categories is the one that we created. Then failed jobs and migrations, again they are put in. In fact, all of these have been put in by the Laravel itself. Users, telescope monitoring, telescope entries, and telescope entries tag. You won't be seeing these telescope related tables in your database because by this time you haven't installed this telescope package. However, you will see this personal access tokens, password reset, migrations as well, because again this has to do with Laravel managing the connection between the Laravel and the database. Failed jobs and category is the one that we have created. So let's look at its data. Currently it's empty. And let's look at its structure. So we have an ID field of type big int, primary key, it's not null, unique. These have all been by default defined. The name is of varchar 255 characters. This can't be null and it has to be unique. Status tiny int, not null, and the default value is 1. Created at is of type timestamp and updated at is of type timestamp, and the default values are null as well. Okay. So this confirms that we have actually created a database in our MySQL server with the name eLaraShop, and it has, besides the default tables, one more table named categories that we have created ourselves. Now we are ready to implement all the CRUD operations in our Laravel project. So since now a database table is involved, that means we must have a model defined through which we are going to manipulate this table from Laravel. And when there is a model involved, that means we need to have an associate controller involved with that as well, through which we will manipulate our model. Remember, our model is nothing but an eloquent way of communicating with the database. So let's go and create the model as well as the controller. So first create a controller, or let's create a model. PHP artisan make model. This is the command that we have to use in order to create a model. And next we have to provide the name of the model. So the name that we are going to give to the model is, let's make it category. Remember, even though this is singular category, what will happen behind the scenes is that Laravel will look at this singular name category and it will associate it with a plural version of this name, that is categories, as a table with which this model is supposed to communicate or represent. Since the database table that we have created has the name categories, so this will work just fine for us. So that's the name we are going to give to our model. Now a model has been created in the models folder, which is inside the F folder, and F folder is directly inside the root folder of the project. So let's click on this models folder. Previously we had one file in the models folder which was users.php that is provided by the Laravel framework itself. This one, however, category, has been created by us by executing PHP artisan make model command. Now this model is by default associated with a database table named categories. However, if you want to change the name with which this category model should be associated with, you can use a protected variable, protected property named table, and give it any name you like. Let's say you can give it singular name category. So now over here we are saying that the table name with which this model should be associated with, or this model should represent, is singular category. But since the database table name in our case is plural categories as well, so we don't need to do this. Okay. So we are done with the model creation. Now we need to have a controller as well. So let's go and create a controller as well by executing a command PHP artisan make controller, and now we have to provide the controller's name. Since we want this controller to be associated with category model, so I'm going to give this name category controller. Now hit in. Okay, so now this has created a controller in HTTP folders, controller folder, and there we have this category controller. Now over here we have to define all the actions that we discussed, which are going to handle different HTTP requests coming from the front end. That means we should have a function defined for index method. We also should have a function defined show method. So index is going to handle the request asking for all the rows in the categories table, and show will only return one particular category. So that means we will be defining some parameters over here as well. Let's ignore those parameters. Let's define all the functions that we have to define anyway. So public function. Now for the resource creation, that means inserting new row, we have to make two requests. The first one is going to be create. Let's create another one, and the second one is going to be save. Put some comments. Display all rows. This one is for display specific row. Request form for inserting new row. Submit form containing data for new row. Now we have to define another function for updating the row. So let's give it name edit. Returns form with specific row data. this one will handle the form submitted with updated data. And finally, we need a method destroy, which is going to delete a specific row. Okay. Remember, many of these functions will require parameters. Currently, we don't know what those parameters are, so that's why I have kept them empty. As we keep on coding, it will be made clear to us if any of those methods require parameters and what those parameters should be. Then we will keep on defining those parameters as well. But for the time being, let's keep them empty. Okay, so currently we have all of these 7 functions defined and all of them are currently empty. Now, the next thing that I wanted to tell you is that since we have defined all of these functions manually, however, if you like, you can create a controller in which these functions are defined by default as well. So let's create a temporary controller so that I can show to you what I mean. So let's create a temporary controller, which I'm going to delete in a while. So PHP artisan make controller. Let's give it name temp controller. And if we want all of these methods that we manually define to be already made available in that controller that is going to be created, we have to attach a flag, which is -- resource. Now a controller has been created, and if you notice, this controller already contains a function named index, create, store. Did I create it? Oh, we have given the name saved to this one, so let's change it to store because this is the convention. Remember, it's just a convention. We don't have to follow it to the letter. However, since we are learning, so it's always better to stick with the conventions. Okay, let's go back to temp controller. Okay, after store, we have a method show. Then we have another method edit, update, and destroy. So this is a shortcut which you can use, but since I had to show, we are learning, so I am not going for the shortcuts. So let's delete this temp controller. We have defined the controller and the methods. Now for each of those controller methods or actions, we have to define a web route in our web.php file as well. Okay, let's define a route. Get. Let's start with the route for the index method. So in our case, the URI is going to be, since they're all for the admin side, so admin / now the category name. Okay, so we have to provide a plural name for the resource. So categories, that's it. So any URL with the path /admin /categories should be handled by a controller named CategoryController. We have to provide : class as well, comma, and then the specific action or the method which we want this request to be handled by, which in this case is index. And the category name and the action are supposed to go as an array elements. So that's why this square bracket. Now we are done with it like that as well. However, as we discussed, if we provide an alias to these routes, then later on if we make changes to this, let's say /xyz, so we have basically changed the URI. In that case, we don't have to go to all those pages where this URI was mentioned and manually make these changes, because we are using the alias, and the alias will automatically be updated. That's why it's always a good idea to use a name for the routes and use those route names wherever you need to provide this URI. So to give it a name, we are chaining another method to it, and the name of that method is name. And over here, we have to provide an alias as a string. We can give any name we like as long as it's unique throughout the project. And again, another convention is whatever is the name of the action, you provide that one as the route. But since we are going to have multiple resources, that means all of those will have a method direction named index. So we have to make it unique, and we have to somehow relate to it with this category controller, so that just by looking at the name, we know which controller it might belong to. So we are going to give it a route name, category.index. Now this is a unique name for this route, /admin /categories. And this is type cat, HTTP verb type cat. Okay, so we need in total 7 routes for this categories controller. So let me copy and paste them. Let's comment out the rest of them. Now let's work on this one. After index, we want a controller which is going to represent the show category. So let's change the index, the action from index to show, and let's change the route name as well from category.index to category.show. Okay. Now let's think about How can we make it unique? So we can make it unique by attaching the, let's suppose, ID of the specific row that we are interested in. Now, because we don't know which ID we are interested in, and it can be different IDs depending on which row we are interested in, so that means this portion should be dynamic. This portion should be inserted in dynamically depending on which particular row the user has shown interest in. So to make any portion dynamic, we can enclose it in this curly bracket. So now this ID is a variable or placeholder in which dynamically some value will be inserted in, and most likely it's going to be an ID, a unique ID for that row. We can keep it ID, or we can make it, give it a name category, singular as well, because this is more in line with the convention that we saw in the Laravel documentation. In any case, you can use any name over here. It is just a variable name or just a placeholder, but putting category over here, this plural category represents the whole resource, the whole table, and the single one represents one specific row. So that's the general convention, and we are going to stick with that. Okay, so we are done with the show as well. Now let's work on the edit and save methods. Sorry, not save, store. I don't know why I keep saying save. Okay, let's uncomment one. And for the edit one, in fact, let's work on the create one, because the edit one will also have a dynamic part as well. So let's go with the easy one first. So for the edit one, let's make the URI unique by appending another part to the path, which is edit. And this is also going to be a get route, so no changes over there. However, the action is going to be edit, and the name is going to be category.edit as well. Then this edit needs to be stored as well. And because this store will contain some data, so post method, because this edit will return as a form which we fill in, and then when we submit the form, this route is going to be triggered. And because this will contain a form, so we have to change the verb, HTTP verb, from get to post. So now since the verb is different or unique, that means we can have same URL. So this URL and this URL, there is no conflict between them, even though they look the same. And Laravel is able to handle both of these requests successfully. So let's keep it same, and let's change it to store. The action is store, and let's change the name from category.index to category.store. Okay, so we are done with creation as well. Now work on the update one. So the update is going to be get method as well, and since we are going to update a specific row, that means we have to provide some unique identification, which is going to be ID in most of the cases. So the curly brackets for the dynamic part, and let's put category over here as a variable name or placeholder. Now this URI and this URI, they look the same. So we have to create some difference between them, which we create by attaching another portion to this part, which is edit. Controller class index, let's replace it with edit, and the name is going to be, the route name is going to be, or the alias is going to be category.edit. Now the second one is going to be submission of that edited form. So since it's a submit one, so let's choose between put and fetch. So I'm going to go with the put, or let's make it fetch, because most likely, because fetch is like fetching a part of something, that makes more sense rather than put. Put feels like putting something new. You can use any one you like, but I'm going to go with the fetch one. Okay. Make it URI. You have to provide the specific ID, unique identification for the row which you want to update. So category. Now again, this URI and this URI feels the same, look the same, but because of having different verbs, there is no conflict there. So let's change the action to update, and let's change the alias, the route name, to update as well. Now the last one is the delete one, deleting a specific row. So to delete a specific row, that means we have to provide a dynamic portion which will uniquely identify the particular row in the database table. So category, and then we have to change the method from get to delete, and the action associated with it is destroy. So let's give it route name destroy as well. Now we have defined all the 7 routes for the actions that we have defined in the controller. However, there is one more precaution that we need to take when we are defining the sequence of these routes. So the thing is this, whenever a request comes in, the router will go through these routes one by one in sequential order. That is, if this is the first route that is defined, the router will try to match it with this one. If this doesn't match, then it will move on to the next one. And if this one doesn't match, it will move on to the next one until it runs out of all the options. In that case, it will return 404 not found web page. So this is one thing. The lookup always happens in sequential order. The other thing is that this placeholder, wherever you place a placeholder, it acts as a kind of a black hole. So what I'm trying to say is that, let's suppose if the URI is /admin/categories/3, then it will be matched by this one. However, if the URI is /admin/categories/3/edit, which should be matched by this one, because this one comes later than this one, that request will always be captured by this second route, and the request will be sent to this show method or show action, which obviously does not do the task which we expect it to do, because this placeholder acts as a black hole. No matter how long your URI is, it will all be consumed by this one. So when this happens, we have to make sure that this one comes later than this one, because over here we are saying there is some black hole, so this black hole will keep on capturing all the paths that you provide until it hits a /. So the moment the portion of the URI path which is consumed by this variable, that path contains /, then it will jump out of this placeholder or black hole and it will start looking for edit. However, if this is the URI that is encountered before this URI, then that /edit will also be part of that placeholder or that black hole, because that black hole doesn't know when to stop. However, this black hole knows when to stop, which is the moment it hits this / character. So we have to make sure that this one comes before this one. So what I'm going to do is that I'm moving this route down. Okay, so now the last 4 routes, all of them contains a placeholder or black hole, you can say, but the first of those black holes contain a criteria to jump out of that black hole as well. So now when a request is received which contains some black hole and then something which makes it jump out of that black hole, then that is the one which is going to be matched with the URI and the HTTP request. So if this doesn't match, then it will look at this one, and this will consume everything in the path, and then it will be executed. So okay, so this is the right sequence, and make sure you get the sequence right. Okay, so now we are done with the sequence of the routes as well. Now there is one last thing we need to discuss before we move on to defining those actions in the controller, which is, now if you notice, this route contains /admin. This route also contains /admin. Okay, basically now this is the route that we created in our first video when we had not actually created a controller, so it was returning a view. So I'm going to comment this out. We don't need this one because now we have created a controller. Okay, anyways, now the rest of the routes contain /admin/category. So all of these routes have this one. This one is slightly different, but it also contains /admin. So we can simplify these routes by grouping all of the routes which begin with same URI path. Since all of them share a same prefix, that is admin, so we can group all of these routes under that prefix. So what we can do is that we can define routes in different ways. So route, then we can use the prefix method, and the prefix is /admin because all of them share this specific prefix. Then we are going to group it. Now this group method takes a callback function or a closure as a parameter. So let's define that closure. Now within this function, we can move all of these routes. So now they are all under this prefix route. So this prefix route starts here and it ends over here. So semicolon is missing. Now since they are all umbrellaed together with this prefix, so now we can remove this /admin from the rest of the routes. So now this becomes empty, so that means it just has this part. Likewise, we have to remove /admin from everything. Okay, so now our route is slightly less cluttered. We can make it even more less cluttered by somehow figuring out how to remove this common URI portion from the path by grouping it rather than through a prefix, but rather than a controller. And grouping it based on a controller will help us simplify this portion as well. Okay, so we are going to, now since this one doesn't have /category, so I'm not going to group it based on the controller. So let's define another route. Now the static method that we are calling is controller. And over here we have to provide the name of the controller, which is CategoryController. So let me copy it, paste. Then we have to chain it with group method. Now again, this group method is going to take a callback function or a closure. So let's define it, function, curly bracket. Let's put semicolon over here. Now let's remove all of these routes up there. Okay, so now they are inside this route controller, category controller. That means now we can remove this category controller name and just stick with the action. So that means we don't need this array, just the name of the action method. So likewise, let's remove this and let's delete this as well. Okay, now our routes are even more simplified. If you like, you can further group it based on /categories by prefixing it like this one within this closure. However, that will be another level of nesting, and I don't want to have that deep levels of nesting, so I'm going to keep it that way. Okay, so with this we are done with the routes as well. Now we need to work on defining the bodies of those actions that we define in the controller. So which route shall we start with? Well, the easiest thing is that we should be able to display all the rows in the categories table if we have some data in the categories table. So what we can do is that we can manually put some data in the categories table and then define the logic for this index method in the controller, which will display all the data from the database table into the browser. But for that, we need to have some data defined in the database table. So either we can insert some rows in the database table manually, or we can do this using another PHP artisan command called Tinker. So Tinker is a command line CLI which allows us to execute PHP commands in the terminal. And we will use the Tinker to create some instances of the model that we have defined, which is the category model. So let me just show you how Tinker works. PHP artisan Tinker. Now this has started another command line terminal where you can write any PHP command that you want, such as echo hello world. Okay. And we got the echo message. We can create a variable name, give it value nj, and now echo hello name. So it is displaying hello nj. So basically Tinker is a terminal where you can execute PHP commands. Now using Tinker, we are going to insert some data in the categories table. And since the tables are represented through models, so we are going to create an instance of model which is connected with the categories table. We have currently just one model that we have defined, which is category. And the category model is by default associated by Laravel with a database table named plural version of the model. Since the model name is category, so that means it's by default connected with a table named categories. So therefore we are going to create an object of category model. That instance will insert a new row in the database table. So let's create an instance. Let's give it name category. So this is a variable. We are going to create an instance of a category model. Now over here from the Tinker, we have to provide the whole namespace for the file that we want to create an object of. When I'm saying file, I mean the class name. So let's create an instance of that category, which is starting from the root namespace. So \app/infect. Let's verify. Let's go to model.php, sorry, category.php, and let's check the namespace. So the namespace is app models. Okay. So /app/models and then category. Hit enter. So now an object of type app models category has been created. Now since this category table contains two values that we have defined ourselves, the other three values are ID, created it and updated it. They will be generated automatically by the Laravel, so we don't need to provide the values for those columns. Likewise, even though the status will get a default value 1 as well or true as well, so we don't need to provide value for that column as well. The only value that is mandatory to provide over here is category name. Let's give it name women. Now this object exists in the RAM, we have to store it in the database. So to actually store this object in the database, we have to call a method on this category object, which is save. Now this return true, that means this row has been inserted into the database table. So let's go and verify it. The name of our database table was eLaraShop something. This one, eLaraShop. Let's go to tables, categories. Now let's see if it contains some data. Now as you can see, we have one row with the name women and status is by default set 1. We didn't provide this status, but because we have set its default value to true, so that's why it has been replaced by 1 in the database. So let's put one more row using Tinker. So let's give this category another instance, models, category. Now, okay. Now let's category name equals main, and now this time let's define the status as well. false value. Now save this, refresh. Now we have another category with the name main, and since we assigned it value false, so it has been replaced by 0, and created 8, updated 8, and ID they have automatically been inserted in. Now let's create one more category, and then we will work on the displaying this data in the browser using the index action. So let's create another object, and for the name, let's give it name boys. Let's give it status true and save it. Okay, so there are 3. Now we are ready to work on the action which will display this data in the browser. So basically we will work on the index method accessing this data using the category model and then returning back to the HTTP request which will display it in the browser. So let's exit the Tinker